In this video, you'll discover what Arthur Schopenhauer meant by pretending to be stupid in a world that punishes intelligence. Because as strange as it sounds, sometimes pretending to be foolish is the wisest move you can make, not to deceive, but to survive, to protect yourself in a world where showing intelligence is a risk, where shining too brightly attracts shadow, envy, and isolation. Here, you'll understand why the most lucid are often the most silent, why so many geniuses learn to disguise themselves as fools, and why perhaps the secret isn't to prove you're smart, but to learn how to use your light in the dark, where no one can extinguish it. This isn't an explanation, it's a mirror, and maybe you'll see yourself in it more than you expect. Sometimes the greatest sign of intelligence is knowing when to stay silent. Have you noticed that? The more you try to show how much you know, the more others pull away. Arthur Schopenhauer saw this with piercing clarity. In a world that punishes brilliance, the fool becomes king, but not the true fool, the one who chooses to appear foolish. Pretending to be ignorant can paradoxically be the highest form of wisdom. A mind that shines too brightly blinds others. And what blinds, disturbs. What disturbs soon becomes a target. Schopenhauer never romanticized genius. He saw it as a social curse. The genius, upon entering a room, triggers comparisons, insecurities, and unhealed wounds in others. That's why the one who senses this and plays the game from below often wins from above. The image of the court jester is more than a caricature. It's a hidden symbol of strategy. The fool saw the king naked, heard state secrets, walked among the powerful, and was underestimated by all. That's the move. Be seen as harmless, as someone who poses no threat. Because when you're not seen as a threat, no one keeps an eye on you. In truth, pretending to be foolish isn't about deceiving others. It's about protecting yourself. It's a way to navigate vanity, inflated egos, and power games without going to war. And if you've ever felt the need to hide how much you know just to keep the peace, then maybe, without realizing, you've already followed Schopenhauer's hidden advice. Have you ever noticed how the room shifts when you show your intelligence? The conversations cool down, the glances turn less welcoming, and suddenly, silence grows heavy. Schopenhauer understood this better than most. Elevated intellect doesn't attract admiration. It provokes distance. Not because you've done something wrong, but because your presence reflects a mirror others don't want to face. The truth is, intelligence disarms others' egos. It exposes the fragility of shallow beliefs, challenges the status quo, and, most of all, wounds the vanity of those who feel inferior. And here's the cruelest part. People won't tell you they envy you. They'll make you feel like you're the problem. They'll treat you with coldness, as if your clarity is a social burden. It's not uncommon for the wisest person in the room to grow increasingly silent, not because they lack words, but because they realize that the more they speak, the more they isolate. And this is where many fall into resentment. They feel they must dim their own light just to avoid disturbing others. But Schopenhauer didn't see this as cowardice. He saw it as psychic survival. Revealing how much you know may seem like an act of authenticity, but it can also be an unintended provocation to someone else's ego. And in that case, the price of honesty is distance. You're not excluded because you're arrogant. You're excluded because your very presence challenges the comfort of collective illusions. And for many, that's unforgivable. Have you noticed how the brightest ones learn, from an early age, to dim their own light? In school, the student who answers too quickly becomes the target of mockery or exclusion. At work, the employee who over-delivers is seen as showing off, hard to manage, or even threatening. The message is loud and clear. Those who know too much make others uncomfortable. And it doesn't take long to learn that the price of clarity is often isolation, or worse, sabotage. Schopenhauer spoke of a kind of intelligence that not only understands the world, but feels its weight. A mind like that, when exposed, awakens the deepest insecurity in others, the fear of being small. That's why, in so many workplaces, the ones capable of real transformation are ignored or silenced, not for lack of skill, but for having too much of it. Think of the meetings where you swallowed your ideas for fear of sounding too smart. The moments you softened your insights just to avoid displeasing your boss. How many times have you hidden your brilliance to avoid stirring up resentment? That's the curse Schopenhauer foresaw. The more lucid you are, the more you must hide to survive in environments where mediocrity disguises itself as harmony. And this doesn't happen only in corporations. It happens in families, friend groups, even romantic relationships. The intelligent one becomes a mirror, and not everyone likes what they see. So what's left? Pretending not to see the obvious, downplaying your own power, playing the game of strategic ignorance, until you find a space where your light doesn't need to apologize for existing. History holds a strange respect for those who choose to appear foolish. Think of Hamlet, who dives into madness as a strategy, or King David, who feigns insanity to escape death. Across different times and cultures, great minds have worn the mask of folly as a shield, not out of cowardice, but clarity. They knew that sometimes truth must be disguised as absurdity just to survive. This kind of feigned madness isn't lying. It's encrypted language. It's the art of self-preservation without total silence. The wise fool speaks truths cloaked in jest. He makes the powerful laugh, but he plants seeds of doubt. He lowers himself to see from above. And in the theater of life, this performance might be the only way to stay on stage without being eliminated. The tradition of the court jester is the most symbolic example. He was the only one allowed to mock the king without losing his head. Because he pretended to be mad, he was exempt from the rules. But being outside them, he saw everything more clearly. And maybe you felt that too, the need to seem harmless, even incoherent, just to say what must be said without being attacked for it. Schopenhauer saw more than historical curiosity in these archetypes. He saw the spirit's survival strategies. In a world where intelligence offends, the wise pretend to be foolish to preserve their sanity. And if even kings feared the laughter of the fool, perhaps we should ask, how much truth hides behind the madness we judge, and how much madness exists in the normalcy we applaud? True humility isn't about making yourself small. It's about knowing your exact size and choosing when to reveal it. Schopenhauer understood that in certain settings, displaying your intelligence isn't wisdom, it's provocation. That's why he proposed something subtler, not hiding knowledge but channeling it with precision. Strategic humility is like keeping a sharp sword beneath a plain cloak. You don't flaunt it, but you know exactly when to draw it. This kind of humility isn't submission, it's emotional intelligence. It's the awareness that direct confrontation often just inflates the other's ego. When you argue to win, even the truth becomes an enemy. But when you stay silent, observe, and choose your words like seeds to be planted, you influence more deeply. Wisdom, when disguised as simplicity, takes root where pride cannot reach. How many times have you wanted to correct someone, to show right there that they were wrong? And how often did that only spark defensiveness, tension, and friction? Schopenhauer invites us to a different posture. Influence through silence, dominate through non-confrontation, teach through presence. It's paradoxical but true. Sometimes the one who speaks least is the one who changes the most. Strategic humility is the art of playing the game without having to prove you're playing, letting others discover over time that you knew all along. And if someone underestimates you in the process, good. The greatest freedom lies in not needing recognition, because while others compete for applause, you build quiet power behind the curtain. When no one expects anything from you, everything you do becomes surprising. Schopenhauer grasped this with surgical clarity. Being underestimated is often the most strategic position one can hold, because while the world sees you as irrelevant, you're free to observe without being watched, to learn without being questioned, to act without being blocked. True power rarely announces its arrival. It moves silently behind the scenes, where the spotlight doesn't reach. When you're perceived as not that smart, naive, or out of touch, people lower their guard, and it's there, in the openness of others, that you find the space to act freely. The apparent fool becomes a kind of reality spy, a master disguised as a novice. Think of the times you let others believe you didn't understand, and that gave you more time to understand even better, or the moments you seemed distracted while actually absorbing everything. These aren't acts of manipulation, they're acts of self-protection, because in environments where truth is threatening, pretending not to see it might be the only way to keep it alive. The beauty of being underestimated is that no one tries to bring you down, because no one sees you climbing, and by the time they notice, it's too late. The board is set, the plan is already in motion. like a chess player who seems to retreat, but is quietly preparing checkmate. In the theater of life, sometimes the most powerful applause is the one you no longer need to hear, because you've already won in silence. Not every battle deserves a response. Not every provocation demands a reaction. Schopenhauer knew this. And more than that, he understood that true wisdom doesn't lie in saying everything you know, but in choosing what's worth saying. In a noisy world where everyone screams to be heard, there's silent power in simply staying quiet. Tactical silence is not cowardice, it's emotional sovereignty. It's when you realize that reacting to an insult only drags you down to the same frequency as the offender. It's when you understand that trying to prove your intelligence to someone who refuses to listen is just a waste of psychic energy. Sometimes inner peace requires swallowing your pride, not because you're weak, but because you have better things to digest. How many times have you spoken in haste and later regretted it? How often have you tried to explain the obvious to someone who didn't want to understand and left the conversation drained? Schopenhauer proposes the opposite. Preserve your psychic energy. Use silence as a shield, as rest, as wisdom, because some people don't deserve your truth, not because it lacks value, but because it would be wasted on closed ears. In the end, well-used silence doesn't push people away. It protects you. It's not absence. It's selective presence. A presence that says, I'm here, I see everything, but I choose peace. And maybe, in this world of noise and inflated egos, that's the most radical revolution of all. What Schopenhauer observed in his time has only intensified in ours. Today, brilliance still bothers, but now it's monitored, muted, camouflaged under the labels of teamwork, humility, playing nice. Deep down, nothing has changed. Showing too much still sparks rivalry, and hiding it well is still a mark of wisdom. In corporate settings, talent that shines too brightly becomes a threat. Instead of being valued, the employee who thinks outside the box is often sidelined, accused of not being a team player. In relationships, it's the same. The one who sees toxic patterns clearly is labeled cold, insensitive, too hard to love. But these accusations don't expose your flaws. They reveal how uncomfortable your awareness makes others feel. And so the modern dilemma arises. How do you preserve your intellectual and emotional integrity without going to war with the world? The answer lies in strategic dissimulation, in appearing distracted when deep down you've already understood everything, in laughing at jokes you don't agree with, in saying maybe when you're already sure, not out of deceit but out of self-preservation. What Schopenhauer offers here is not a recipe for submission, but a manual for psychic survival. He shows us that playing the social game wisely is an act of maturity, because it's not always the one who shines the most who wins. Sometimes the one who survives with their soul intact has already won. There's a quiet beauty in someone who doesn't need to impress, a calm strength in someone who chooses simplicity, even when they're capable of great complexity. Schopenhauer saw this as a higher form of intelligence, the ability to let go of intellectual exhibitionism in favor of genuine connection, because sometimes what truly moves people isn't what dazzles, it's what comforts. Simplicity disarms. It doesn't threaten, it doesn't compete, it doesn't belittle. And that's precisely why it's so powerful. When you speak clearly, without trying to prove superiority, people open up. When you listen without rushing, without correcting, without trying to win the conversation, you become a mirror instead of a wall. And in that space, something rare emerges: trust. In a time when vanity wears the mask of wisdom, being simple has become a revolutionary act. You don't need fancy words to say something profound. You don't need posturing to earn respect. Those who live this truth understand. The most refined intelligence isn't in what's said, it's in the silence between words, in the pause that lets the other reflect, in the look that says, I understand, without saying a thing. Schopenhauer understood that simplicity is not the absence of depth. It's a conscious choice about where to place your energy. And when you learn to do that, everything changes. You begin to attract people for who you are, not for what you display. And in that moment, your presence speaks louder than any argument, because wisdom, in the end, is what remains when the ego goes quiet. Not every wise person wears a robe. Sometimes they sit quietly in the corner of the room, listening in silence, smiling softly while the brilliant ones fight for attention. Schopenhauer understood. The true power of the mind isn't found in the applause it receives, but in the freedom it earns. And often that freedom is born in silence, in the choice not to stand out so you can see more clearly. Flashy brilliance is seductive, but exhausting. It demands constant maintenance. It has to be reaffirmed over and over again. Stealth wisdom, on the other hand, sustains itself. It doesn't need to prove what it knows because it already knows. And when you move like that, silently, strategically, you start to notice something deeper, that the most profound changes rarely happen center stage, but backstage. Being brilliant attracts attention. Being discreet attracts invisible opportunities. While those who crave the spotlight expose their vulnerabilities, those who know how to remain unseen can act with more precision, more freedom, more intelligence. It's the paradox. The less you need to be admired, the more admirable you become. The less you fight, the more control you hold. Schopenhauer shows us that there's greatness in not being the main character, but the hidden author of your own story. And in the end, that's what separates those who merely impress from those who truly influence. Because while brilliance calls attention, silent wisdom changes destinies. Have you ever stopped to think how many times you've silenced your intelligence just to be accepted? How often you've hidden your deeper insight just to avoid disturbing those who live on the surface? Maybe you've never pretended to be stupid, but on some level you've learned to camouflage yourself. And now the question is, for how long? The world will keep punishing those who think too much, feel too much, see too much. But the choice of how you respond will always be yours. You can keep trying to be understood, or you can become incomprehensible because your peace is worth more than anyone's validation. Write in the comments, "I choose my peace." And if this video spoke to you, if some part of it stirred something inside, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and stay with us, because here your clarity will never be punished.